Hi, I'm John Moulis, and welcome to another in my series of videos about my time at the Department of Finance and the incredible bullying and harassment that I received there whilst I was there in the late 1970s and early to mid 1980s. Now I'm up to 1984 now, and 1984 was one of the worst years of my life, caused by the treatment I received at the Department of Finance. It really was terrible. I mean, the first half of the year, or whatever, I think up to about August, that wasn't so bad. I mean, the campaign against me by Galloway and Walsh, the bosses there at the Department of Finance, that was moving up into top gear. I mean, I was getting complaints against me about every few days. Every few days I was being called in to either the supervisor's or the director's office or whatever to answer some new complaint, some new allegation made against me. Like I said, highly spurious, opportunistic, and just very and organised, and it was an organised campaign, an orchestrated campaign. I mean, the people putting in the complaints. I mean, I've had people who put in complaints against me during that period, telling me that they told their supervisors when they got back to where they worked what had happened, and that they didn't want it to go any further. They just mentioned it to supervisors, but the supervisors automatically forced those people to make formal complaints against me, because the campaign, the objective was to force me out of the department, to force me to resign because of the resentment that the bosses felt about me being confirmed in the public service in the first place. They felt that I should have been kicked out way back in 1978. And there I was in 1984, 6 years later, still there, still being an irritant to them. And so anyway, the complaints kept going in and everything. But I knew what was going on. I mean, I knew that it was part of a conspiracy to force me to resign. And but anyway, I tried to keep it at arm's length during the first part of 1984. And, 1984, that first part, it was a good year apart from work. I mean, everything else in my life seemed to be coming up roses. I mean, I had bought a camera a few years earlier, Nikon FG, the old film camera, and I was taking some really good photos with that camera. I mean, I was winning prizes in photography shows and at the Royal Canberra show. I mean, there was that. There was journalism. I mean, I was writing letters to the editor, and I was at home. I was pretending I was a journalist writing long-form articles that I kept there, and I submitted several of them to newspapers. And the other thing too, which was coming up roses, was my fitness training and my bodybuilding there at the gym. I mean, I actually managed to make money out of that during that period. I mean, guys had come up to me and asked me what I was doing, what routine I was doing, to look the way I did. And I realised I could make money out of this, so I made up programs for them, and I charged them $30 for those programs, and it was like a cottage industry I started up. And in the gym, guys were coming up to me wanting to train with me because they saw how I looked and that. I realised that there was an ulterior motive with most of these guys, that they wanted to hook up with me and and have me as a sex partner. I mean, I didn't really mind that, as long as they did their training and they were fair dinkum about getting fit and building up muscle, and I was charging them for those sessions, and when I look back at it now, that was what they now call personal training. I was effectively a personal trainer. I mean, I did it when the boss of the gym and the staff in the gym weren't looking. I mean, I didn't make it too obvious what I was doing. But, years later, they came up with personal trainers where you pay $30 a session or whatever for a personal trainer. Anyway, I was charging for that too. So that was, and all of those things were new interests of mine and new things which I could have gone on with for to make new careers out of. I could have gone into photography, but there was so much competition. There were so many professionals involved in photography. There was journalism. I mean, I possibly could have got a job with a newspaper and everything, and I loved newspapers. I really did like the printed word, and that I used to read all the newspapers every day, and the fitness industry. I mean, there were no back then you didn't need a fitness certificate. You didn't have to do a course or anything and have qualifications. So I could have done all of that. And then right in the middle of all of that, the biggest wedge of the day was work, where everything was going wrong. I hated it. It was just awful. And like I said, I mean, everything, and at home, I didn't get along well with my father at all. We used to have big fights and everything, but during that period, I didn't have any fights with him. Things were going all right on the home front as well. And as I saw it, everything in my life was coming up roses except for work. And that was the fly in the ointment. And I couldn't get things to work, to function properly at work. It was just, and when all of these complaints started up and all of this harassment and everything, nothing I did would bring it to an end. I mean, I'd keep going back there, and I discussed it with people in office services, what was happening, the complaints against me, and someone suggested that perhaps I was a little bit too political, because, by that stage the Labor government was in office, the Hawke government was in office, and I was seen as a Liberal supporter. I was writing to the Australian, criticising the Hawke government and advocating that the Liberals should come back into office when it wasn't fashionable. I mean, that was the era where Bob Hawke was Mr. 78%. I think he went up to Mr. 82% approval rating, and people like me were a lone voice in the wilderness. But anyway, and so, Harry Brown in office services said, look, just talk about small talk. That was the term he used, small talk. Talk about the weather or inoffensive things. So back in the print room at the counter, that's what I started doing. I started talking about the weather and that. And they were still putting in complaints against me. And I'd say to the director, I said, look, I'm just saying small talk. And they considered that to be a problem. Me talking was a problem. I mean, I was just in a no-win situation there. It was incredible. No matter what I did, they found cause to complain about it. And as I said in the last video, many of these complaints were complaints literally about nothing. I did absolutely nothing. They'd give me the copying over the counter. I'd photocopy it, hand it back to them. They'd have a dirty look on their face, a sour look on their face, and they'd run off to the director and complain about me. It was a highly personal thing. They just didn't like me as a person. And they were manufacturing all of these so-called complaints. It was just straight out bullying of the worst kind. It was psychological bullying. And we look, and I told you in the last video about, I was charged 3 times under the Public Service Act during 1984, and the first time was successful. Galloway charged me. The second one in about August was unsuccessful, and Galloway, they printed out draft charges under the Public Service Act and gave it to me, and by this stage my head was absolutely spinning. I was completely disoriented by this barrage that was coming at me just day after day, relentless, and these draft charges. But what happened is that there was doubt whether the charge could go ahead. So they had to check with the Deputy Crown Solicitor's office as to whether the charge could go ahead. And the Deputy Crown Solicitor, they renamed it the Australian Government Solicitor, but the Deputy Crown Solicitor threw the charges out. And they wrote back to Galloway and said, in our opinion, this represents a management problem rather than a personnel problem. Well, that, in the public service, that was about as severe slap in the face as you can possibly get. And I didn't know it at the time, that this exchange of correspondence had taken place, because Galloway wouldn't let me look at my personnel file there, and I didn't know that they had started up another file hidden from me called the disciplinary action file, which correspondence like that went on to. So if I did look at my personnel file, those papers weren't on my personnel file, so I would have been completely ignorant of it. I only found out about it in 1988, 3 years after I was forced to resign. When I went back to look at my files, they pulled out 5 files on me, and one of them were, I think, 6 files, and one of them was the disciplinary action file, which had a high privacy marking on it and wasn't to be seen by me while I was an officer of the Department of Finance. And after Galloway got this letter, this huge slap in the face, the campaign against me was just ramped up to astronomical levels. It just escalated out of control. It just became absolutely ferocious after that, and I didn't know what was going on, because at the time there was a lot of resentment towards me about some of the letters to the editor that I was writing, specifically advocating gay law reform in New South Wales. And at the time, there was also the hysterical AIDS scare whipped up by the newspapers, and that created a huge backlash. It was really, for a while there, it was real redneck stuff. It was just back to the 1950s, and at the end of 1984, that was when the 3 babies in Brisbane were killed by tainted blood transfusions from a gay blood donor. It really was a torrid time. It was just awful. And in that period, the complaints against me just were flooding in. And they were just getting ridiculous. And even areas where I was totally in the right, that Galloway and Walsh would rule against me. For example, there was one complaint. We had a rule in the photocopy room, the whole department knew about it, that if you had more than 20 originals for photocopying or printing, you had to leave it and pick it up later, because we had a lot of work coming in. We had one machine there, we couldn't tie up the one photocopier with a large job while there were people queuing up at the counter. And a lot of them, and everybody knew about this rule, Anyway, this girl came in from registry, little bitch. She'd only been there for about 2 weeks, so she had enough time to acquaint herself with the rules and that. She came in with, and this was another manufactured complaint. She was sent in with, I think, 30 originals. She wanted 3 copies of each, collated and stapled, and I said to her, you have to leave it and pick it up later. And she said, no, it has to be done now. And I said, no, it has to be left. I mean, that was the rule. And she said to me, she said, go and stick it up your ass, and walked out. And then a complaint went in about that. You know, she was told by her supervisor to put in a formal complaint about it. I mean, the supervisor, the OIC of registry, wrote out the complaint himself and got her to sign it. That went in, and, you know, and that was an open and shut case. I mean, I had been in the department for 7 years at that stage. You know, I had 7 years more than 7 years of seniority over this girl. And yet, despite all of, you know, and saying to a senior officer, go and stick it up your ass, I mean, that, in any other case, that would have meant instant dismissal. Certainly in private enterprise, if an employee had said to a boss, go and stick it up your ass, or a supervisor, they would have been sacked on the spot. Yet, Galloway and Walsh ruled against me yet again. I mean, every single time they ruled against me and upheld the complaint, and they said that I had caused her trauma and distress by my attitude, and that her saying, go and stick it up your ass, was a justified response. I couldn't believe this. I mean, looking back now, what I should have done, I should have said to Galloway or Walsh to their face, go and stick it up your ass. You know, what are you going to do now? And of course I would have been charged under the Public Service Act again. You know, it was this double standard involved, that if I had done that, you know, all hell would have come down against me. But, you know, because she was a young girl, you know, against me, they automatically upheld it. And of course that was meant to send an unmistakable message to me, that no matter what happened in the department, no matter how much in the right I was, that they would automatically rule against me, that I had no chance there. And the message was sent, and like I said, it was a campaign to make things in the department, the work conditions for me, so unbearable and intolerable that I would be forced to resign. It was part of Galloway's campaign, part of the strategy he put forward to the interviewers in late 1983 when he was given the job as Assistant Secretary, Management Services Branch, Department of Finance. And I had picked it up, I twigged to this, and I actually went in, you know, when the next complaint came in, you know, Walsh was there, the director, with the thing in front of him, reading out word for word what I supposedly said, this he said, she said thing. And it just sounded so ridiculous. And after he finished talking, I said to him, when are you people going to stop this? When are you people going to stop this bullying and harassment of me? And you know what he said to me? He said, when you resign. When you resign. So he was actually admitting that the objective of theirs was to force me to resign. You know, whatever it takes. And nothing was out of bounds. Nothing was too outrageous. The objective was to push me out of the department. And they pursued that aim relentlessly. But at that stage, I didn't know the second their plan B if that failed. And boy, you know, that was really Machiavellian. That was real, it was real cloak and dagger stuff. And I'll get onto that hopefully in the next video where I talk about 1985. Okay, goodbye and